Thanks for joining me for this lesson. I'm going to be talking to you about the practice of leadership. Having covered the principles of leadership, or in other words, the foundations, the very truths that establish our understanding of what leadership is, we can start to expand upon that and, and contemplate what leaders actually do in practice. We can also think about ways of understanding what they do in practice, or in other words, the theories of leadership. But let me share my slide deck with you so that you can follow along with me and make notes and freeze this presentation as you need to. I'll share the screen. First things first, I just want to rehash what that principles of leadership lesson is about. I think that's necessary because there were three key things we learned over there. 1.1, as I have it here, I drew a distinction between managing and leading, or in other words, not every manager is necessarily a good leader, but similarly, not every good leader is necessarily a good manager. 1.2, leaders can be successful and they can be unsuccessful. I drew a picture for you. Do you remember it? Here it is again. My point was that everything we do as a leadership action is something which we want to have giving rise to very effective outcomes. The alternative, of course, is that we'll settle for less effective outcomes, and ineffective outcomes are almost as bad as unsuccessful leadership. There's no point in doing it at all. So 1.1, 1.2, and now 1.3. Leadership is a function of power. Power that comes from one's position, or what I've referred to here as authoritative power, and power that comes from one's influence. One's influence is a function of one's personality and one's expertise. Just being really good at what you do will cause some people to follow you. Of course, positional power is what your title gives you. It enables you to boss people around. Now, with those three things out of the way, let's have a look at the point of these two episodes in leadership practice. First of all, I need to draw you a timeline of the evolution of leadership theory. And once we have that, we can elaborate how leadership theory has developed, really, because our theories have become more fulsome, more elaborate, more detailed. They give us a greater understanding and insight into what actually happens when there's real leadership going on. And that means we're going to contrast the trait, behavioral, and contingency models, and then look at the modern models. And the modern models are really about relationship theories of leadership. But let's look at that timeline. There it is. And if we are to contemplate the evolution of leadership theory, it just strikes me as I constructed this presentation for you that it's probably necessary to define what theory is again, because we can't expect you to have this committed to your everyday vocabulary. So here it is. A theory is, for most of us in our day-to-day lives, just a hunch that we have about how things work. And we will say to our friends, hey, I've got a theory. It's not really a theory. It's just an untested hunch that you have. And for scientists and academicians, a theory is a well-substantiated explanation of an aspect of our world, comprising facts and laws and hypotheses. What that means is that we can predict what's likely to happen in a given situation if we have an understanding of what the theory is of what is likely to happen. All of us are aware of the theory of gravity. We know what's likely to happen if we push a cup of coffee off the edge of the table. It's going to fall to ground, not so? That's what a theory is. We can predict that if something is pushed off tables, it's going to fall to the ground. So back to that timeline. We see here the great man theories, and those held sway in terms of what we were recording in management science literature right up to the early 1900s. And they kind of gave way then to the so-called trait theories, because we're saying that characteristics of leaders are important. We can't simply claim that people are great because they just are great. We're saying they're great because they have certain characteristics. There are flaws in that, and we'll talk about that in a second. And then we get to this behavioral theory, um, which I think you should understand as a function of the human relations school of thought, which said that, or which holds um, that life is a series of interactions between people, and we should respect those interactions and honor the interactions between people. That didn't give way to the contingency or situational theories, but we saw the emergence of those from about the 1970s. They were popular in the 1980s, well into the 1990s, and I must point out to you, they still hold true. It's not like the theories have gone away. The theories still hold true. And then the so-called reciprocal theories, which emerged in the last century, but which have become very popular in the last 10, 20 years, as we contemplate what leadership is and the mystique of leadership. So first things first, over here, we must address what we mean by trait theories, not so? So the logic is that there are certain characteristics that leaders demonstrate. They are driven people. They have an ambition to lead, and they are very confident, but very honest also, with a sense of integrity. They're very smart, and they are experts at what they do. They have job-relevant knowledge. But there's a problem with that, a real big problem. Not all leaders are necessarily honest, and not all leaders are necessarily characterized by integrity, and not all leaders, for that matter, are necessarily characterized by being experts at anything, for that matter, except perhaps leading people. And that we have to understand then is probably an exercise in their charisma, as opposed to an exercise in their actual job ability. Be that as it may, the trait theories, while a little bit debunked, still in some aspects hold true, but they are limited in their application and limited in their ability to predict what might happen in a situation. As I pointed out 2 minutes ago, was the objective of a theory. So what we saw emerging then in the last century was the behavioral models, and the behavioral models basically distinguish two things. This is absolutely fundamental because this is going to govern the rest of this lesson. So bear this in mind. We're saying that leaders are going to be characterized by consideration or concern for people, or they're going to be characterized by their initiating structure, which is a fancy word for getting the job done. So you can be job focused or you can be people focused. If you're job focused, it's a simple way of saying that you rank high on a dimension of initiating structure. That's job focus. Or you can be people focused. In other words, you're worried about the relationships that you enjoy with people. Now, with that in mind, if we're talking about consideration and initiating structure, then the most popular model that illustrates this particular theory is that of Blake and Matton, and that is a theory which dates back to the mid-1960s. And I'm going to draw it for you over here. You can haul this up online if you like, or you can look at your textbook for a copy of it, and I do recommend that you look at the textbook. And what we see here are two dimensions, two axes. Even if you didn't do well at maths in school, we know that this is the x-axis, and on this axis we're simply plotting from 0 to 10, shall we say, although they've only got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 on this axis, a concern for production and an initiating structure, a task focus, as opposed to a people focus, where similarly a leader is someone who can be very focused on people or not particularly focused on people. So a so-called 1-1 leader is someone who's going to rank low on a concern for production as well as low on a concern for people. And Blake and Maton simply called this impoverished management. It was something that they thought was going to be characterized by someone who was just so out of it that the job didn't get done and the people weren't happy either. There doesn't seem to be any point in that. In contrast, if you rank very high in terms of your initiating structure or your job or task focus, as well as very high on your focus on people, then you're going to be a 9 leader, and they refer to this as team management. Similarly, you can talk about a 1-9 leader and a 9-1 leader, and each of those has a description. I'm not going to belabor the point. I'm going to ask you to look into this and spend 15 minutes familiarizing yourself with regard to what the Blake and Maton managerial grid represents as a theoretical approach and as like the poster child, like the exemplar of what we mean when we talk about behavioral management. You recall from my agenda, I said that the thing which followed, the theories which followed behavioral management were so-called contingency models. Well, the contingency models are still about a focus on the job and a focus on people, but we're saying over here that there's an interplay between what the manager is like and what they do and the situation in which leadership takes place. That's a crucial one because it's fundamental to the models which the contingency models, particularly of the 1990s, and I have one that I'm going to be discussing with you in some detail and illustrating for you. But for a period of 40 years, shall we say, the contingency models held sway. And in other words, academicians and scholars and practicing managers said, this is how we understand the practice of leadership. There are several types of contingency models. And the point of this is that we know that leaders are going to act, or we can predict rather. We can predict that leaders are going to act differently depending on the situation with which they are faced. In other words, the situation in which they have to lead. And situations are going to be a little bit too much for some leaders, but they'll be ideal for others. So some leaders will blossom in very fierce situations, and other leaders prefer things to be a little bit more calm and settled. What's important or core is that different situations require different leadership behaviors. So there are different types of leaders, and respect these theories again: relationship-oriented leaders, people-oriented leaders, people-focused leaders, and task-oriented leaders. And these task-oriented leaders are worried about getting the job done. Very little different in this, do you see, from the models, the behavioral models which preceded them. I prefer to think of these as situational leadership models, and I'll cover the basics of this with you over here. 3 foundations underpin Fiedler's model, and Fiedler maintained the extent to which followers like, trust, and are loyal to their leader serves to determine how favorable a situation is for leading. Think about that. Relationships can be good or poor. If I'm leading a group of people and we have a poor relationship, then that is going to characterize the nature of the leadership actions that I undertake and the nature of your followership actions. Task structure is a critical one. The extent to which work is clear-cut. means that if things are very clear-cut, then it's easier to simply get on with the job. If things aren't very clear-cut, then you recognize the leader has a responsibility to clarify that haziness for the followers. As a leader of a group where things are not very clear-cut, I can't simply say, get on with the job to my followers, because that's really unreasonable. I need to give them more clarity, more guidance than I would have to if it was a simple, clear-cut case of getting something done. And then third, in Fiedler's model, position power. The position power that a leader can enjoy can be very strong if they have a lot of authority, and can be very weak as positional authority. Remember the two types: positional authority and personal authority or expertise. Your positional authority is what counts in Fiedler's model. So Fiedler is saying, are there some people that leaders really like? And is the task clear cut or not? And does the leader have a lot or a little bit of position power? And on the basis of these three things, Fiedler then said you could predict what would happen in a particular situation. In other words, the best leadership for a situation depends upon those three things. And that being the case, a task-oriented leader will struggle to lead where leader-member relations are poor if there is a need for the leader to clarify and explain how things should happen to the followers. Again, if I'm a leader of a group of people and the situation isn't very clear-cut, and I don't have favorable relations with those people. In other words, if I'm a really harsh boss who likes to boss people around, people who boss other people around really take the time off to explain, to slow down and break things down into steps. So particularly where the task structure is unclear, then task-oriented leaders are going to struggle. On the other hand, where things are clear, then the task-oriented leader will be able to get away with being task-oriented, if you like. We're also saying that a task-oriented leader will rejoice in situations characterized by having high position power, because they're simply saying, get on with the job, followers. They like being the boss, remember. But relationship-oriented leaders do better when leader-member relations are poor to start off with, because they take the time and trouble to engage with people. Where task structure is poor, they take the time and trouble to engage with people to clarify what needs to be done. And when position power is weak, then the relationship-oriented leader does better in so much as a weak task-oriented leader is not going to be able to rely on their positional power, whereas a relationship-oriented leader is able to rely on their expertise and the nature, the quality of their social relations. So that's Fiedler's model, a bit of a complex one. And I can tell you from personal experience, there is more than a grain of truth to this, but it's not telling you how to behave. Now, here's the thing. The theories which developed from this starting position gave us a perspective that said maybe you need to experiment and practice and rehearse behavior patterns which will allow you, as a leader that is, to modify your behavior to suit the situation. So it becomes appropriate to be task-oriented when you don't have to be anything more. And it becomes appropriate to be relationships-oriented when the task requires it, when the situation requires it. So we'll come back to this. But that's Fiedler, and I strongly recommend you spend some time getting to grips with Fiedler's model. Then we've got House, and House came along with something he referred to as path goal theory. Effective leaders motivate subordinates to achieve goals by identifying the outcomes very clearly that they're trying to achieve. In other words, you specify the structure of the task and dishing out rewards for high performance and clarifying the goal, the path rather, to attainment of the goal. So if you make it clear for people, and you support your subordinates and you point out precisely what it is that they should be aiming towards, then your leadership outcomes are likely to be more successful. And if they are successful, they're likely to be more effective. That's what we want, don't you think? That's what this is all about. So House pointed out that you get 4 classes of leader. You get directive leaders. They boss people around. They let employees know what is expected of them. They schedule the work and they say, go, get the work done. This is the guidance you need, now get it done. A supportive leader, on the other hand, is someone who is more concerned about the relationships and will devote a lot of time to supporting the psycho-emotional needs of followers. A bit like Blake and Matton's country club leaders, really. Then you have participative leaders who consult with employees and use their suggestions before making a decision, as it says over there. That sounds very much like the Blake and Matton 9-9 team leader, don't you think? Why don't you go back to that and have a look at it, or make a note to go back to it later? And then finally, House maintains that they are achievement-oriented leaders who set challenging goals and expect employees to perform at their highest levels. So not a copy of the Blake and Matton managerial grid, but I'm saying that you can certainly draw similarities between these theories. Now, what I prefer as a frame of reference is what was introduced, if I recall correctly, in the early 1990s, a model of situational leadership by Hersey and Blanchard. Their situational leadership theory was based on the notion that you adjust your leadership style, which they very simplistically call telling, selling, participating, and delegating, depending on the willingness of the followers or readiness of the followers, as well as the nature of the task. And we're going to devote some time to that when I come back in the next lesson. But I think, or the next episode of this lesson, but I think that is enough for now.